Hi, this is Carl Irwin with a tutorial. We're actually going to look at Blender. We haven't looked at Blender in a long time. And part of that had to do with the changeover that was coming with a new Blender release, Blender 2.8, a release in which not merely the front-end visual devices, the graphic user interface was going to be changed, but really the back end was going to take on a considerable overhaul. Various render platforms were going to be upgraded, changed, let go, replaced, and because of that inevitable transition, I felt that the tutorials that I was doing in Blender, which involved a lot of kind of hacky sort of resolutions to quick rendering problems on very low-grade machines, was really at its peak and at its end until we got this new version. And once we got the new version and I could see what the capabilities were going to be, it would be easier for me to come back. Well, we have the new version. We're in a release candidate stage right now, and probably very soon we'll have a relatively fully functioning application, 2.8. And there are some things I know I'm seeing in the new release that are still big question marks. There are some choices, options, buttons, settings that don't seem to do anything. I don't know if they're going to do something in the future, particularly on the material and shading level and some of the more working sorts of atmospheres like the Workbench render engine. I don't know what some of these things are going to do. I know that there's the halo material is still referenced for particles. That doesn't seem to have a use, but it's still there. I don't know. So there's some questions I still have, whether or not some things are left over in the code and need to be taken out and struck out permanently, or if some things are just at a low level of development right now and will be re-implemented in a better way in this new release. I kind of hope for the second one, because some of those things that I see in there point to some really good options, I think, for us on this particular channel to get some hacky sorts of tricks going on our renders. That being said, I did jump into the program here now that we're in release candidate stage, and I tried to do some old tricks, old sorts of setups that I was doing on the previous release, just to see what the difference was and what the benefits were going to be. And I found a number of great benefits that I think we can talk about that will not only show us a way forward, I think, for this channel, for those of you that are interested in what we do here, at least in terms of Blender, but also can help to validate a lot of those other tutorials that you saw on the previous versions of Blender. And I think this will help to demonstrate a manner in which those older tutorials are still applicable. You can still go back and watch those tutorials. They still have something to teach you. There's no reason to remove them, even with this change to the new program, because many of those principles still apply now. And we get some added benefits, I think, too. So this is the scene we're looking at. Very, very simple scene. Just to explain what's going on here, it is a matte painting. This is a 2.5D or a three-dimensional composite matte painting. So what we're looking at is actually a painting that's been projected appropriately onto geometry with a three-dimensional model in there as an element, and some other things. There's some lens flare and some lens kinds of effects going on there, plus the effects that come with the render engine that we're using. We'll talk about that in a moment. But that's really all this is. And I've done things like this on the old Blender platform on 2.7 and previous 2.6. As we look at 2.8, much of what we discussed on those other platforms still applies now. However, with the change in the default Viewport render engine, which is now Eevee, which is a variant on OpenGL. It's an OpenGL-driven render engine that has a lot of greater capability with higher-powered graphics cards. We're not going to get into a lot of that because I don't use a lot of high-powered graphics cards. I think it's probably worth pointing out right here at the onset This is a Lenovo ThinkPad T420. It's an older machine. I think it has a quad-core processor. I think only 8 gigs of RAM. It's a fairly low-end machine. I think the onboard graphics card, and it's an onboard, it's not an added or a changeable graphics card. I think it's an ATI card. I'm not even sure. I don't think it's an NVIDIA. But this is an older kind of home computing sort of laptop. It was used at a business that was recycling, and it's a secondhand computer to me. And I work with a lot of computers like that. So keep that in mind as we're looking at this, that they seem to have the 2.8 release here pretty well organized, such that it's working on older hardware even if you don't have high-end graphics cards. Now, that being said, I do have machines and access to machines that won't run 2.8, and that's just something we're going to have to reckon with here, that the increased ability in the rendering capabilities of 2.8 is going to outdate some hardware. It's just going to transcend what older hardware can do, and there's really no looking back. I have some computers that won't even start the application properly. In fact, when the application starts, it crashes the computer entirely. So you're going to run into that, and because of that, I think it's nice that Blender is an open source application with an open source community, and they provide previous releases in their download section. So you can keep on using 2.79 and use all the capabilities that 2.79 had. It is still being updated even right now before this release candidate goes to a full new release. So stick with your 2.79 whenever you need to use those machines, and please feel free to look at my older tutorials and any other tutorials related to that platform. That is still a very, very good, very fast rendering application that has access to the Cycles render platform and some pretty good OpenGL capability too. So that being said, we are running 2.8. Let's take a look at what's going on here. You can see again, this is just a composite with a projected scene, painting. Pretty good camera move on it, in spite of the fact that it is a projected scene. The imagery, which we'll look at here in a moment in GIMP, was a pretty large image, about 4,288 pixels by 2,848. So pretty large image, pretty large texture, which gets you some pretty good detail here. That's it. Let's take a look. One other thing before we get off of this video, there is some motion blur. Motion blur is still not fully capable in the Eevee render engine, which we'll discuss that in a little bit down the road here in this short look. I did my motion blur as a post-process using an old technique that I developed on 2.79. So I'm still using that old hack, which is pretty easy and accessible to do in the video sequence editor. We'll discuss that when we get there as I look through this little project here with you. So no in-camera motion blur here. The motion blur that you have right now in 2.8 in Eevee is a camera-based motion blur, which does multiple sampling based on the camera motion only, but not on object motion. So there is some motion blur, but it's not really terribly usable outside of the movement of the camera. So I just disable that, which gets you a faster render. Again, we'll talk about that when we get there. So anyway, that's the video, that's the project. Let's take a look at what goes into this. So I have here a GIMP project, which has just a couple of layers that I composited together. It's just a 2-layer matte painting. Very quickly on matte painting, I may do some tutorials on this in the future, dealing with some matte paintings, and so not specifically Blender, but it's always been a love of mine to do matte painting kind of projects and do three-dimensional compositing using Blender. I think it gets you more bang for your buck to do that when you're dealing with open scenery or environments, and then placing three-dimensional objects or elements into that scene. It's just a better way to render quickly. So I really enjoy doing that, and we may look at that down the road. But this is just a two-layer matte painting. So we have a background layer which was put together from a number of images. I'm not going to get into how that is done, but it's kind of this canyon figure here with a plain sort of ground and then a plateau. And then on top of that, we have another layer which is this mountain ridge. So the objective here is to project these onto geometry inside of Blender, which is an old concept which we've discussed on the channel before. I'm not going to get into it. You can still do that using the same means as before. The menus are in a different place, but the capability is still there to do that. Blender 2.8 has upheld the import image as planes capability and the camera projection mapping capabilities. It's very simplified, and it runs perfectly with the new shading platform that they have there for Eevee and Cycles. So, and it's all viewable in the Viewport. But anyway, that's what we're dealing with. So I have this matte painting to use. Let's take a look at the project here in Blender. So this is the Blender project. Very quickly, again, just kind of a little interlude here about the channel. I haven't been doing Blender stuff for a while, probably more than a year or two, as we've been waiting for this change. But I have been doing some other things dealing with music, which is really what my profession is. I'm a musician, a music teacher, and I'll continue to do that as well as these Blender tutorials as we try to pick up some of the Blender stuff. I also have another YouTube channel that I've been working on, another reason why I've been away from this channel. Another hobby of mine is close-up magic, and I developed a YouTube channel called The Common Magician. It's for people that do magic as a hobby, card magic, close-up magic, and not necessarily as a profession, but they desire to do presentations that look very professional, very well polished, and just astoundingly entertaining. So I have this other channel I've been working on. If you have an interest in that, check me out at The Common Magician. That channel is growing and is getting a lot of content, has been for a few years now. So anyway, back to Blender. So we are inside of this environment here where I have brought in some geometry, and I used the camera imagery capability, which is still present in Blender 2.8. You will find it by selecting your camera in the scene, going to the camera settings, and then you'll see down here it says add image, and you can import an image or a movie clip, and you can set it to the back or the front sort of kind of composite view, and you can project your textures from a matte painting using this trick that we used before. So you're still able to do that in Blender 2.8. That is a capability that we still have. When you are on your camera view, you would select your geometry, tab into edit mode. Let me very quickly enable what we can see here. Tab into edit mode so you can see your geometry, and then go to the edge option here. New location in the menu. I'm sorry. Go to the UV option, okay, which is pretty logical, and click on Project from View, and you'll be able to project the UV mapping from your camera view at the dimensions of your matte painting. Again, this is old information from older tutorials. You can check that out. But it's all still capable. We can still do that here in Blender 2.8. So what we end up with is this. If we go to the Eevee rendering, and it loads in, and this is what we have. So we're looking at a shadeless projection of our matte painting onto geometry, and that gives us the ability, as in any 3D composite, to move the camera in space. And if we back this up and hit play, you can see the camera motion going through here in our three-dimensional object moving around. Now, this is the Eevee render engine. We are rendering in Eevee, but most of the objects in here are shadeless. There's no lighting on these. The only lit object that is not shadeless is this drone right here, which I got from BlendSwap. It was a free-to-use zero license drone that just seemed to fit this little test that I was doing. I imported this, and I changed the materials very slightly. If we select this object here, we can see the materials that I have going on. I made one material that was sort of glossy and metallic, and one that was a little less metallic, a little bit rougher. And then I used a noise texture to give me a little bit of a grunge sort of layer where I could mix these two textures together. And again, if I was in cycles, what I see is what I get for the most part, because that's how they are running Eevee and cycles together, that they are very compatible in their node materials, and that one should give you a very good representation of what you will see in the final cycles output. Now, for us on this channel, that means that we're going to be doing a lot of rendering in Eevee. Specifically, rather than using cycles. We're just going to use the Eevee OpenGL capabilities. Now, the nice thing about Eevee is that we have some additional options that are rendering much quicker now as we're nearing the final release. So, for example, if we go to our settings here for our render, we can enable bloom. And bloom is where we have kind of the brighter portions. If I turn this off, you'll see it, but the brighter portions will get a little bit of a kind of a fog that is overlaid on them, which is a natural artifact that appears in camera lenses. So this bloom effect, that's something that we're using. Also, ambient occlusion. We can apply ambient occlusion, and it will affect our model here. And because it's a 3D matte painting and the geometry is pretty well spaced out, it doesn't really affect our three-dimensional matte here in the background. It just affects our three-dimensional model in the foreground, which is what we want. But we can apply that and render that in directly without having to do a separate sort of layer. Now, again, we're using the Eevee render engine, but because we're using shadeless materials and we're just doing a three-dimensional composite of a matte painting, I have my render sampling set way down, which should give me a much faster render. So this is our first hack. When you're doing shadeless rendering, you can probably turn down your sampling quite a bit more. You will notice that it will get a little bit blocky once you get to a certain point if you're using a lot of three-dimensional geometry. So I found that for my purposes, 8 was about as low as I can go, and I probably should go a little bit higher if I was giving a really serious render, but I put this all the way down to 8 on here. So you want to set not only your viewport render, but also the render output to 8 so that you can render as quickly with OpenGL as you can with the direct render output from Eevee. So very quickly in 2.8, rendering. If you go up to the render tab, you can hit render image or render animation. It will render on the Eevee render engine. But you can also go to the View tab and come down to Viewport Render Image or Viewport Render Animation. And what this does is it will pick up on the settings that are related to the viewport. So if you have these set the same way, you will get essentially the same speed in your output. Now, why would you pick the viewport over the regular Eevee render output? Well, I have found that there's some back-end things that are going on that I can't explain and I really can't point to that do give a little bit of a variance in speed. And sometimes you will find in certain scenes the Eevee render engine will render better directly, and rendering from viewport will render more quickly in other circumstances. So you just want to keep that in mind. When we get into the video sequence editor here in a minute, you'll find that we will render only from the viewport because there seems to be something amiss at this point in this release candidate using the Eevee render engine output from the video sequence editor as it is right now. So I'm not sure what that's about, what's going on there, but there does seem to be an issue when using scenes in our situation here. You can find a lot of the same settings that you did in the old render setup. However, they are spread out in some different locations. We have our render settings here separate from the camera sort of output dimensions and other sorts of settings. They've kind of separated those out. Post-processing down here for using the sequencer or the compositor. We're going to be compositing via the sequencer, which is something that I like to do and have done tutorials on this channel. We're going to continue doing that. It gives us a little bit more of a real-time look at our compositing that the compositor itself, the node compositor, doesn't do. So this is the setup. Now, here's another great trick that I've discovered. we are losing a capability that I can't seem to find, or the capability is gone. And maybe you can comment in the comment section below if you know something that I don't. But before, in OpenGL rendering, we had the capability to apply what we call X-ray to certain objects. And the real purpose of that is for the purpose of setting up a scene. You can see an object through everything else as you're trying to position it or work with it. We used to use that as a hack on this channel to actually place lens flare that was in the deep background on the foreground and composite that in the viewport. That capability does not seem to be here anymore. We still have all of the shading capability to apply additive shading in the viewport, so we can use lens flare and see through objects, transparent or additive objects in that way. But we don't seem to have that X-ray capability working properly or really even mapped the way it used to be in the function that it used to be in the Eevee viewport. So I did discover that it's not really that big of a deal, because we can still use separate scenes and composite those scenes together. And as you're going to see here in a moment, the video sequence editor is using the Eevee rendering output, including all of the Eevee layers, screen space layering that we find, such as the bloom and the ambient occlusion and various other options on here. They are being rendered in the video sequence editor scene strips. And that's a real big plus. We didn't used to have that in the 2.7 Blender, where we could use things like ambient occlusion or depth of field, but we do have that now. We're able to get that capability in the video sequence editor. So let's take a look. I have another scene here, which is the lens flare scene. And what I did is I just brought in, I made a copy of my first scene. I set my lens flare in place, and then I just disabled all of the other objects. So you can link objects too, so when you move it in one scene, it will move in the other. But I just kind of aligned everything that way, and then I set my render output to be comparable to what I would need for lens flare. So here I have my render output down to 2. My sampling output for both render and viewport is at 2 samples. Because it's a lens flare, I don't really need a lot of detail in that. Okay, so I've got my 2 scenes set up, and now for some of the magic, if I go to another scene, which is my composite scene, I can go to the video sequence editor, which you have to add. It is not a default tab up here. You do have to add it in your project, which isn't too hard to do. But we go here, and now I can see a full direct composite of my scene that has everything in it. And I can do one render output with my full composite together, including any sort of color correction or grading, anything that I would want to do in my composite using the video sequence editor. So I've got my scene strips down here. I'm using one scene strip, the main scene strip, to kind of determine the alpha overlay that I want for my lens flare, and then my lens flare is set as an additive blending mode. On top of that, I have some lens grit as well, and then some adjustment layers for correction. So this is my final output without any motion blur. If I was really going to do this probably more properly, I would probably add my motion blur as a process before I do my final color grading and my lens grit overlays. But I just I decided to try this without that, and it seemed to work out just as well to do my motion blur at the very end. But I'm sure that it does cause some discrepancy with some things like the lens grit that should be static. It adds a little blur to it later on, but that's okay. Here we have the same capabilities that we had before. However, they are improved in the viewport on the video sequence editor. I noticed one issue. If I set this here to rendered, which should be rendering the Eevee output, I find that it doesn't seem to map properly, and I'm getting alpha overlay. That shouldn't be happening by my estimation. I should be looking at what I was just looking at, but instead, when I select my look dev, it actually gives me what, to my understanding, is actually the Eevee render output. So you'll notice that there's a look dev on the layout view which gives you essentially all of your shading but does not give you the overlay capability that Eevee has. So I don't know why it's different here. Like I said, I think there may be an issue that they'll have to work out before the final release or even thereafter. But right now, as of release candidate 3, you would want to select Look Dev, and it would give you the Eevee output for all of your scene strips, including the ambient occlusion and the bloom or anything else that you have enabled. Screen space reflection, refractions, all that kind of stuff. So, that's pretty much it. I'm not going to get into materials right now. There's plenty of tutorials to talk about how to develop materials for your objects in Eevee and your shading. I just wanted to really show you this one little nice upgrade that we're getting. You can get a faster output by lowering your proxy size quite a bit, and it will play back a little bit faster. You have a lot of the same capabilities in the video sequence editor that we had before. Your playback, you can set here to have audio scrubbing, mute audio subframes. You can have it skip frames going forward, frame dropping, whatever the case may be, however you want to watch. So these are the various settings that I used to render out, and then from here we can render. Now, notice that I said that when we had this set to rendered, it didn't render properly. And notice what happens. If I go up to my render tab up here and I hit render image, which should render via the Eevee render output, notice that I get nothing. I get that same issue. So again, I don't know what's going on with that as far as the scene strips are concerned. However, with the Look Dev enabled, what I want to do when I go to render is click on View and use my old school OpenGL render output. And now if I hit Sequence Render Image, it will render the Look Dev image that I had before. If you give it just a couple seconds here to render this image out. And it didn't work for some reason. Let me see what's going on here. I'm going to go to View, Refresh All. Let's refresh. By the way, there used to be a refresh button that is no longer there. You have to go to View to click on that, or the option is Control R to do that. Let's try this again. I think I'm on the right thing here. Right settings. Right output settings. Yeah, let me see this here. So we go to View, Render Image. And there it is. So you need to use the OpenGL render output to get the Eevee output using the Look Dev settings. So I don't know why that is. That seems like an error to me. So we'll see if that sticks that way or not. Maybe some of you are better in the know than I am. But you can see what we're getting is everything that we get, the benefits from Eevee. All the ambient occlusion, the kind of glare overlay that we get, all of the shading abilities that we get. It's all there. So plus the overlays of scenes in the video sequence editor. That's very good for us that want to render very quickly using simple tricks, matte painting, shadeless objects and scenes and whatnot. Very quickly, let's take one last look at the last portion of this little project, which is the motion blur. I found that we can use the motion blur that I developed on 2.79 in 2.8 as well. We'll set this here to scene render size. What we have is the output from the last scene then being laid in multiple layers. And what I did is I created, and you can see my previous tutorial, it still applies. We'll probably talk about this again in the future, some upgrades that I've made to this process. But what I did is I made a matte that picks up on contrast changes between frames. So if we take our scene strip, or rather our final render output, and offset it like this, so you can see it's offset by frames, and then we take those and we match them against each other such that you have one with an original framing, which is no multiple samples at all, versus another array where the frames are offset one to the other with a bit of a crossfade, it will give you the difference between those two. And then we can take all the saturation out and then add the darks with an inverted color curve to the lights, and it gives us something that looks like this. So this is highlighting all of the changes that are going on. If I go back to the very beginning, you can see that there's not a lot of highlight in here on the very first frame, but as it moves along, as there is motion, you'll see that it brightens up. And that's showing us what is changing from one frame to the next. Okay? And this is used as a matte to apply to a blurred layer to give us the essence of motion blur. So it's an imperfect sort of hack to generate motion blur on top of imagery that doesn't have it and did not shoot with it originally. So I'm using that here to get my motion blur. And it works extremely well in 2.8. It renders very quickly. This hack works very well. It seems to me that the effects like the Gaussian blur that we need to do this, again, check out that old tutorial. It renders very quickly in 2.8. So you can see how it gets a lot brighter here as the camera starts to pan and move. That's because there would be a lot more motion blur. So this is a matte that is then being applied to an overlay. I'll show you that overlay here very quickly, which is here, has a Gaussian blur on it. And if I disable this overlay, you can see how sharp everything is here at a point where there's a lot of faster motion. I turn on the overlay and you can see how it's adding in that essence of motion blur. And I set the opacity down until it seems about right, case by case. So anyway, one post-processing run through the video sequence editor renders out very quickly. Now from here, I found that you can use actually the real render output because we're not using scene strips to do this. It's not rendering through a pipeline from a scene. So this renders fine no matter what render output you're using. But when we're using scene strips, I'm still finding that you need to use the OpenGL option from the View tab. So anyway, those are the discoveries that I've made with 2.8. So a few upgrades in there. One last discussion about this view layout view here on the main scene. Let me go to my camera view. You will remember from the older tutorials where we're dealing with compositing in the viewport that there was an issue with OpenGL and what is known as draw order when we're dealing with transparency. There is transparency in this scene on this geometry right here. If I set this to geometry, you'll see that the actual projected texture is short on this geometry, and that means that there must be some transparency going on there. And this object was actually created after the object in the background. Now before, what we used to have to do was parent to a separate object like an empty and then unparent it in the proper order to create the draw order manually. The new upgrade in OpenGL and Eevee does not have that OpenGL restriction where it takes the draw order based on which object is created first. So we can actually create our scenes from the reverse going to the foreground like you normally should be able to do in a 3D compositor. And the camera automatically and dynamically updates the draw order depending on the location of the object. So that is a nice upgrade that we can will help us as we are putting together transparent materials inside of the scene for rendering. I did find a few hacks that I'm not going to talk about in this tutorial that we can use related to transparency and object. The origin of objects. We can move the origins of objects to kind of fool the camera into seeing the draw order differently, and that has some implications for us down the road, and also helps us in fixing a few little errors that pop up occasionally when doing this type of 3D compositing. But in general, everything is nice and dynamic now, so that is a major upgrade that we can really, smile about in this new version. So very excited to continue on in these tutorials in Blender, and we're going to keep examining fast rendering strategies, using the viewport, using a graphics card rendering, or using low process CPU rendering, using this Eevee render engine. Probably, hopefully in the future, we'll also look a little bit at some of the other render engines as well, including the Workbench render engine, which looks like it will have some texturing and material capability. We'll be looking at what the implications of this dynamic OpenGL rendering of transparency has for particle systems and various materials that we can use in particle systems in creating very fast smoke or other types of particles that render very quickly using transparent textures and shading. So a lot of exciting things, I think, coming in the future as we get more and more stable in 2.8. So that's my short run through on some of the things that I've discovered. Please leave your comments below, and I wish all of you happy blending.